Being a high school student with a packed schedule means I usually have to juggle classes, after-school activities, and chores at home, so by the end of most days, I barely have any energy left. On top of that, I have a little Shorkie named Avi, and she isn't the type of dog that will let you forget she needs her walks. She's only 2 years old, full of energy, and if I don't take her out regularly, she gets restless and starts having accidents on the rugs. My parents make me responsible for her, so even if I'm swamped, I have to figure out how to work her into my day. One night I ended up coming home a lot later than usual because of a club event at school. The buses were running behind, and by the time I walked through the door, it was already close to 9. I still had chores and homework waiting for me, so I decided I'd take care of all that first and then walk Avi afterward. It took way longer than I thought, and when I finally looked at the clock, it was pushing close to midnight. At that point, I was exhausted, but Avi wasn't letting me off the hook. She kept whining, pawing at my leg, and following me around until I finally gave in and grabbed her leash. The neighborhood where I live is shaped like a big square, with smaller roads cutting through and only a handful of streetlights scattered around. The main road nearby is well lit, but inside the complex it gets dark fast. That night, with how tired I wasn't paying much attention as I walked Avi. I've done late walks plenty of times, and usually it's quiet since most of the people in the neighborhood are older and asleep by then. I made my way around the square and was about halfway through when I noticed someone else up ahead. It was unusual because I rarely see anyone out that late. The man had a hood pulled up, a cap underneath, and was dressed in a way that made it hard to make out his face. What caught me off guard, though, was that he had a dog with him too. I didn't recognize either of them, which stood out since most dog owners in my neighborhood know each other. His dog looked like a pit bull, though a bit smaller than usual. Avi is normally sweet and quiet, but she has this way of knowing when something feels off, and when she barks, it's usually for a reason. At first, she wanted to approach and sniff the other dog, but then her whole demeanor flipped. Within seconds, she started barking and growling like crazy, pulling against the leash to get away. The man tugged his dog back quickly, but instead of just leaving, he kept throwing quick glances at me as he walked off. Half asleep and trying to calm Avi down, I didn't think too much about it in the moment. I continued along the path, but the further I went, the more unsettled I felt. The streetlights barely lit the area, leaving big stretches of darkness. As I walked through one of the lit spots, I suddenly saw the man again, standing at the edge of the light like he was waiting. He wasn't walking his dog anymore. He was just standing there, facing away until I got close. The moment Avi noticed him again, she lost it, barking louder than before. My instinct told me not to get near him, so I crossed to the other side of the street and tried to act casual. When I glanced back, he was staring right at me, and something about the way he locked onto me made my whole body tense. I didn't hesitate after that. I started running. At first, I thought maybe he'd just ignore me, but then I heard the sound of his footsteps picking up behind me, and his dog, too. Adrenaline kicked in, and even though I'd been out of practice since cross-country season ended, I pushed myself to run faster. Avi kept up easily, but the sound of him chasing us made me panic even more. Instead of heading straight home, which I knew would be risky if he saw where I lived, I veered off toward a playground and cut through one of the narrow alleys. For a second, I thought I had shaken him, but then Avi's jingling collar gave us away, and I heard him coming after us again. I scooped her up and bolted down another alley filled with tall grass, not caring about anything except getting out. That path led to the main road, which was brighter and more open, so I turned sharply and sprinted until my chest burned. When I finally tried pulling out my phone to call for help, I realized the battery had died earlier in the evening. At that exact moment, I heard his dog barking again, closer than I wanted to believe. Completely out of breath and terrified, I did the only thing I could think of. I screamed at the top of my lungs while running. The noise must have drawn attention, because a car suddenly pulled up alongside me, and the driver rolled down the window yelling. It was one of my neighbors, a middle-aged woman who recognized me, The man chasing me immediately stopped, turned, and disappeared back the way he came. I collapsed right there on the ground, exhausted, while Avi acted like nothing had happened. My neighbor jumped out, scolded me at first for screaming so loud, then changed her tone once I explained what had happened. She drove me back home, where my parents were waiting, and after that night, I promised myself I'd never take Avi for such late walks again. This happened about a year ago, after a late night with my girlfriend. I had gotten into the habit of walking her home no matter how late it was, partly because I wanted to make sure she got back safely, but also because I didn't mind the walk itself. It gave me extra time with her, and usually I got a hug or kiss at the door before heading back. My place isn't that far, around a half hour on foot, so most nights it wasn't a big deal. The night I'm talking about, though, I wasn't in the best shape for walking. A couple of days earlier, I'd twisted my ankle playing ball, and while it wasn't a full injury, it still bothered me if I moved the wrong way. Normally, I could have just taken the bus home, but we'd stayed out later than usual, closer to 2 in the morning, and the last bus leaves around midnight. That left me with no choice but to limp my way through the streets. There's one thing about the route that always makes it a little unsettling. To get back to my neighborhood, you have to pass by this big psychiatric hospital. The place takes up a lot of land, and while there's a longer route I could have taken to avoid it, that would have added an extra half hour, and my ankle wasn't having that. I'd walked past the hospital more times than I could count, so it wasn't like I was scared of it. But at night the grounds look very different. The lights don't cover every corner, and the huge shadows thrown across the buildings make the place feel less like a medical campus and more like something out of an urban legend. That night I had headphones on, messing around with some beatboxing, when I got close to the entrance gates. It wasn't the first time I'd passed by there after dark, and usually it was quiet, maybe a light or two left on in one of the wings, but nothing dramatic. My friends and I had even played ball on the court there in the past, so I knew the layout well. Still, walking alone at 2 in the morning past a massive psychiatric hospital gave me more than enough reason to speed up a little. I was almost at the bus stop near the corner when I noticed someone. At first I thought he was just a random person waiting, but there was something odd about how he was standing. He wasn't looking down at a phone or checking his watch. He was just fixed on something across the street. From where I was, I couldn't see what he was staring at, because the other side of the road was empty. There weren't any cars parked there, no houses with lights on, nothing. I slowed my pace, more out of instinct than anything, and pulled one earbud out so I could hear better. My hand automatically went into my pocket where I keep my keys, angling one between my fingers just in case. It wasn't that he was dressed strangely. He actually looked like any other guy in casual clothes. But the way he stood there so rigidly made me uneasy. Even when I got closer and walked past, he didn't move or acknowledge me, which honestly made me even more tense. The strange part was what happened right after I passed him. I'd barely gone a few steps when I heard the sound of his shoes hitting the pavement behind me. He wasn't running, just walking, but the timing couldn't have been a coincidence. I didn't want to panic, so I kept my pace steady, acting like nothing was wrong. But inside my chest was tight. Without music in my ears, I could hear his footsteps matching mine, and it was clear he was following me. Instead of going straight, which would have taken me through some darker parts of the street, I decided to cut right into a side street that ended in a cul-de-sac. It probably sounds dumb to head into a dead end, but I grew up in that neighborhood and knew the back ways. I could get around fences and cut across open yards faster than most people would expect. When I turned down the street, I caught a glimpse of him in the glass of a nearby building. He stumbled for a second, like he hadn't expected me to turn, but then adjusted and kept on me. At that point, I stopped holding back. I pushed through the pain in my ankle and sped up, acting like I was heading for one of the building entrances. At the last second, I veered off and vaulted over a low fence that separated the street from a grassy lot. I didn't stop to see if he followed. I just kept moving until I was far enough into the neighborhood that I couldn't hear his steps anymore. When I finally dared to look back, the street was empty. I got home not long after that, limping worse than before but grateful to have made it back. I never saw the man again. There were rumors floating around afterward that a couple of patients had managed to get out of the hospital around that time, but I never found out if that was true. The thing is, he didn't look like the patients I'd seen before. He seemed too alert, too sharp. Whoever he was, I'm just glad I didn't find out. Back when I was about 15, I spent most weekends crashing at my best friend's place. Her name's Talia, and she lived closer to town than I did, so it was always kind of a hub for the rest of our group. That particular weekend, two of our other friends, Jade and Shauna, came over too. We were having the usual sleepover type night until Jack, a friend of ours who lived across town, invited us over. It wasn't too far, maybe a 10-minute walk, but since it was already after dark, Talia decided to stay behind. She hated the idea of walking around late, but the three of us figured that together, we'd be fine. When we got to Jack's, the vibe was messy from the start. Jack was 17 and had already raided his mom's liquor cabinet. On top of that, a couple of people we didn't know too well were hanging around, drinking heavily and arguing. It wasn't exactly the kind of night we had pictured. One of the girls, completely sloshed, latched onto me and started unloading all her personal drama. How she wanted to dump her boyfriend, how she was still hung up on her ex, the whole dramatic soap opera. I barely knew her, but I let her ramble. Eventually it got late, close to midnight, and Jade and Shauna decided they were done. They called Talia's mom for a ride home because walking back across town that late didn't sound appealing. I, on the other hand, got stuck. The drunk girl begged me to stay, saying she didn't want to be left alone with her boyfriend. And for some reason, I gave in. At the time, I thought of myself as pretty tough. People at school even had this whole image of me as the scary goth girl who always carried a pocket knife. So I figured walking home alone later wouldn't be a big deal. Around midnight, I finally left Jack's. I texted Jade as I started the walk, making sure she'd stay awake so she could unlock the door when I got there. The streets were dead quiet, and even though I wasn't scared exactly, the silence put me on edge. I kept a brisk pace, almost jogging, because the idea of being alone in the middle of town at that hour didn't sit right with me. When I got to Main Street, the last stretch before Talia's house, I noticed a car approaching from my right. It was still a little ways down, moving fast, so I ran across before it reached the intersection. As soon as I stepped onto the other side, the car screeched to a stop and swung hard onto the same road I was taking. The sound of tires grinding against pavement snapped me into survival mode. I ducked into a thick row of bushes in front of someone's house. Luckily, I was dressed head to toe in black, so I blended in with the shadows. From there, I watched the car crawl down the street, moving at a slow, deliberate pace. The headlights scanned across the road like they were searching for something, or someone. My chest was tight as I held my breath, trying not to make a sound. The car reached the end of the block, circled a parking lot, then came back the same way. The second it turned back toward Main Street, I sprinted. My legs carried me faster than I thought I could move. At the same time, I fumbled with my old flip phone, sending Jade panicked texts to open the door immediately. Every step closer to Talia's house, I felt like the car was going to come roaring back. And of course it did. Just as I made it up to Talia's porch, gasping for air, the car came flying down the same road, engine revving like whoever was inside was furious they hadn't caught me. The timing was insane. Jade flung the door open right as I got to the steps, and I dove inside. We slammed the door shut, locked it, and I finally explained what had happened. She stared at me wide-eyed, trying to make sense of it all. The next morning, when we told Talia and her mom, the reaction was immediate. Her mom's face went pale as she pulled up a news article she had read recently. A man had been caught in a neighboring town for stalking and attacking women late at night, driving the exact kind of car I saw. The realization hit me like a brick. That car wasn't just some random drunk driver. It could have been the same guy. Looking back now, years later, I'm thankful I listened to my gut and hid when I did. If I had kept walking in the open, I might not have made it back at all. Back when I was 14, something happened that still makes me uneasy whenever I think about it. My parents had gone out for the evening to have dinner with some family friends, so I was home by myself. I lived in a quiet neighborhood where most people left their doors unlocked, and for the most part, everyone trusted each other. It was the kind of place where nothing ever really happened, which is why what went down that night still feels so surreal. A neighbor had asked me to take care of her dog while she and her family were away on vacation. It was easy enough, just a couple of short walks, food, water, and making sure the dog was put up for the night. Around 10:30, I headed out for the last walk of the day. The streets were empty, the air was cool, and I actually enjoyed the short trip to her place. Everything about the night felt normal until I started heading back home. After locking up her house, I stepped onto the driveway and immediately noticed a van parked a few houses down that hadn't been there earlier. The engine wasn't running, but two men sat in the front, arguing and gesturing at each other. Their voices carried down the street. As soon as they spotted me, the man in the passenger seat jumped out. He moved quickly onto the opposite sidewalk, walking in the same direction as me, just a little behind. I wasn't panicking yet, but something about the way he kept looking over at me made my stomach twist. He picked up his pace and stayed in line with me from across the street, not breaking eye contact. My grip tightened around the keys in my hand, and my legs itched to run, but I kept forcing myself to walk steadily. A few seconds later, he started crossing the street, and I froze. By then he was only a couple of feet away. His hand lifted slowly, like he was about to rest it on my shoulder. The moment his fingers brushed against me, adrenaline kicked in. I spun around and bolted toward the nearest backyard. He let out this short gasp, like he didn't expect me to run, and then I heard his footsteps pounding after me. I darted between fences and gardens, taking the long way home, because the last thing I wanted was to lead him straight to my front door, where the van could easily pull up. I could hear his breathing growing louder, heavier, and then more distant, like he was struggling to keep up. Ahead of me, I spotted a wide storm drain opening, one of those concrete pipes that ran under the street. Without thinking twice, I squeezed myself inside, crouched low against the curved wall, and covered my mouth to quiet my breathing. My whole body shook as I tried to stay still, praying he wouldn't find me. Minutes crawled by like hours. Eventually, I heard the sound of a car door slam and an engine start up. The van pulled away, and the street went silent again. I stayed inside that pipe longer than I probably needed to, close to 20 minutes, before I finally crawled back out. My legs felt like they could barely carry me, but I forced myself to run the rest of the way home. By the time I burst through the door, I could hardly see straight. I dropped my keys, stumbled into the bathroom, and got sick before collapsing on the floor. The shock of what had just happened didn't fully hit me until I was curled up there, crying alone in the dark. I never told my parents or called the police, partly because I was scared I'd get in trouble for being out so late, and partly because I thought I'd handled it myself. Looking back now, I realize how serious it really was, and how reckless I was for keeping quiet. For months afterward, I barely slept through the night. Even now, years later, I still find myself scanning the street whenever I hear a van engine idling nearby. I'll never really know what those men wanted, but the way that one of them came after me while the other waited in the van still makes me think the intentions weren't good. I can only hope they never tried the same thing with anyone else. Back when I was in middle school, my mom had a nightly routine of going out for walks really late, sometimes closer to midnight than to 10 o'clock. She said it helped her clear her head after the day, and she liked the quiet of the neighborhood once most people had gone to bed. The area where we lived wasn't exactly remote. It was a typical suburban allotment, but one side of it bordered a fairly busy road that connected two larger routes in town. Cars still passed by at that hour, though not constantly, which meant the road could feel both open and isolated depending on the moment. One night, she set out like usual, starting down our curving street toward the stop sign where it met the main road. From there, her routine was to turn right and walk a stretch until she reached another connector road, which eventually looped back into the neighborhood from the opposite side. The walk wasn't that long, maybe 20 minutes if she went at a good pace, but it was enough for her to get the time alone she wanted. Not long after she made the turn onto the busier road, a dark pickup came down the opposite lane. She didn't pay it much attention until she noticed it swing into a driveway just a little ways up, pause there for a bit, and then turn around. The truck passed her again, going back the way it had come. At first, she chalked it up to someone missing a turn or realizing they were headed the wrong way. It wasn't until the truck showed up again, this time pulling into another driveway closer to the connector road and waiting longer, that she started to feel uneasy. When it came by her the second time, it didn't just drive past, it slowed down. She could see the driver staring in her direction, and that's when her nerves started to spike. She kept walking, pretending not to notice, but the pattern was too strange to ignore now. The truck went up to the intersection, turned onto the side street, and pulled into the very first driveway. This time, the headlights switched to brights as the driver began turning around again. By that point, my mom had a choice. She was close enough that if she ran through the neighbors' yards, she could cut straight home. But she knew if she bolted directly for the house, whoever was in that truck might figure out where she lived, and the thought of leading them right to our front door was worse than staying out in the open. Instead, she veered off into one of the yards by the road and crouched behind a tree and a shed, pressing herself into the shadows. From that hiding spot, she had a clear view of the street without being visible. She stayed completely still, listening to the truck as it rolled back onto the main road. It didn't speed away. It idled there for a moment before slowly turning into our neighborhood. Her heart was pounding because she knew it wasn't just passing through. The driver was taking their time, almost creeping as they made their way down our street. The truck drove as far as the curve near our house and sat there for a little while before pulling into the driveway of a neighbor 3 houses down to turn around. The brights clicked off, and it eased back onto the road before heading out the same way it had first come. Even after she saw it leave, she stayed hidden for several minutes, making absolutely sure it was gone before she came out of the shadows. Then she cut through the yards as fast as she could, until she was safely back home. After that night, she avoided her old route for a while, choosing different streets whenever she wanted to walk late, and she never forgot the feeling of being watched and followed that closely. When I was a kid, I grew up just outside the city limits where the neighborhoods still felt half-built. The main roads had pavement, but a lot of the side streets were still dirt and gravel, and only every few blocks had working streetlights. At night, the place turned into long stretches of shadows, with random patches of light from a porch here and there. My best friend lived a block over at the end of a cul-de-sac, and I spent a good chunk of my childhood walking that route after dark. Back then, none of us thought twice about being out late without parents hovering. It was just what kids did. One night, I left his house earlier than planned because I couldn't get comfortable trying to fall asleep on his couch. I checked the clock as I slipped on my shoes. It was just after 3 a.m. He was passed out, and I figured it wasn't worth waking him up just to say I was leaving. The walk home was short, barely 5 minutes, but those 5 minutes felt longer than usual that night. The air was damp, and there was this heavy mist that made every sound sharper. You could hear gravel crunching under each step, like it echoed off the whole block. Walking down his street, I had that restless feeling you get when you're trying to keep your mind from wandering, but can't quite lock onto anything. Sometimes I'd hum or think about a TV show to distract myself, but that night I was so tired I couldn't focus on one thought for long. All I remember is feeling uneasy as I made my way toward the long stretch of road that had no lights at all. The only glow came from a few porches scattered far apart, and the rest of the street just dissolved into blackness. Right as I stepped into one of those dark gaps, a memory from earlier that summer popped up in my head. My mom had told me that a registered offender lived somewhere along my friend's street. She had seen the guy once at the park and made a big deal about me staying away from his house. I was trying to remember which one she had pointed out when I thought I saw something move up ahead. At first, I brushed it off as my imagination, but then my eyes adjusted, and it looked like someone was standing perfectly still at the edge of a driveway. The shape was tall and stiff, blending into the trash can set near the curb. I kept walking, glancing sideways so it didn't look like I was staring, and the closer I got, the more convinced I was that it was a person. My chest tightened, and my heart was pounding so hard it felt like I could hear it in my ears. That's when I caught my foot on a rock in the dirt and went down hard, scraping my knee and elbow. The sound must have been loud, because by the time I looked up, someone was towering over me. It was an older man I'd never seen before. His hair and beard were both white, his face hollowed out like he hadn't eaten properly in weeks, and his skin had this washed-out look under the moonlight. He leaned down, gripping me firmly by the shoulders, and pulled me up with surprising strength. For a second, I couldn't move at all, just staring at his sunken eyes. He whispered, "Hello," and then placed one hand on me in a way that froze me solid. In that moment, it felt like every ounce of energy in my body drained away. I don't know how I managed to move, but instinct kicked in. I tore myself free of his grip, and instead of chasing me, he just stood there, almost like he expected me to leave. I sprinted harder than I thought I ever could, not stopping until I reached the corner where my street met his. When I finally turned to look back, he was still standing in the same spot, unmoving, watching me run. By the time I made it inside, my mom was furious at first, thinking I had just gotten hurt messing around outside. But her anger disappeared once she realized what had happened. We called the police, and I described the man as best I could. He didn't match the offender she'd told me about, which meant it was someone else entirely. Nothing ever came of the report, and my mom guessed he might have been a homeless man who had wandered into the neighborhood. Either way, after that night, I stopped walking alone after dark. Even now, years later, I still dream about that white-haired man, standing frozen in the shadows, waiting for me to pass by.